The rope cut into Lydia's wrists as the executioner's assistant dragged her across the frost-covered ground toward the wooden platform that had been erected at dawn. Her bare feet scraped against the ice-crusted earth, leaving bloody trails that steamed in the frigid morning air. The crowd that had gathered to witness her death jeered and spat, their voices rising in a cacophony of hatred that seemed to pierce through the winter silence like daggers. She had always known this day would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon ever since her 16th birthday, when her true heritage had been revealed. The blood that ran through her veins was considered poison by the Silver Moon Pack, a curse that could not be allowed to spread or contaminate their pure bloodlines. Alpha Marcus stood at the base of the platform, his silver hair gleaming in the pale sunlight as he watched her approach with cold satisfaction. His blue eyes held no mercy, no recognition of the girl who had once served his meals and cleaned his chambers without complaint. To him, she was nothing more than an abomination that needed to be eliminated before it could bring disaster upon his pack. The crowd parted as she was hauled forward, revealing faces she had known since childhood, people who had smiled at her and accepted her help with their daily tasks, now twisted with disgust and righteous anger. "Lydia Blackthorne!" Marcus's voice boomed across the gathering, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority that came with his position as Alpha. "You stand accused of harbouring tainted blood, of being descended from the cursed Blackthorne line that brought plague and death to our ancestors 3 centuries ago. Your very existence threatens the purity and safety of Ka, our pack, and therefore you have been sentenced to death by the Council of Elders." The words washed over her like ice water. There she had heard them before during her trial 3 days prior. Her legs trembled as she was pushed up the wooden steps, each plank creaking under the weight of her executioner. The rope that would soon encircle her neck hung from a thick oak beam, swaying gently in the winter breeze like a serpent waiting to strike. She could smell the fierce sweat of the crowd, mixed with the clean scent of snow and pine, could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, as if trying to drown out the inevitable. The executioner, a massive man with scarred hands and emotionless eyes, positioned her beneath the noose, while the crowd below grew increasingly restless. Their bloodlust was palpable, a living thing that seemed to reach up from the ground and wrap around her throat even before the rope could claim her. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the face of her mother, dead these past 5 years from a wasting sickness that had consumed her from within, but all she could see was darkness and feel the bitter cold seeping into her bones. "Do you have any last words, abomination?" Marcus called out, his voice dripping with disdain as he gestured for the crowd to quiet their jeering. The silence that followed was more terrifying than their hatred had been, a void that seemed to swallow all hope and leave only despair in its wake. Lydia lifted her chin and met Marcus's gaze, her green eyes blazing with defiance, even as her hands shook with cold and terror. "I curse you all," she said, her voice carrying farther than she had expected, reaching every ear in the assembled crowd. "I curse your bloodlines, and your children's children. May you know the same fear you have shown me. May you understand what it means to be hunted for something beyond your control." The executioner slipped the noose around her neck with practiced efficiency, the rough hemp scratching against her skin as he tightened it just enough to hold. Her breath came in short gasps as she felt the weight of her own body pulling against the rope. felt the wooden platform beneath her feet that would soon be gone. The crowd had fallen completely silent now, as if her curse had struck them dumb, and in that moment she almost believed that her words might carry some power, some last desperate magic that could save her. Marcus raised his hand, and she knew that when it fell, the platform would drop away and leave her dancing in the air until her neck snapped or her lungs gave out. Time seemed to stretch, impossibly thin, each second feeling like an hour as she waited for the inevitable. Her wolf whimpered somewhere deep inside her chest, a creature that had never been allowed to run free, never permitted to hunt or mate or experience the joy that other wolves took for granted. It would die with her, unborn and unloved, another casualty of the Silver Moon Pack's obsession with blood purity. The hand began to fall, and Lydia closed her eyes, preparing for the sensation of dropping through space into oblivion. But instead of the expected jolt and sudden stop, she heard shouting from the edge of the crowd. Voices raised in alarm and confusion. Her eyes snapped open to see dark shapes emerging from the forest that bordered the execution ground, moving with inhuman speed toward the gathered pack members. "Rogues!" Someone screamed, and the crowd erupted into chaos as wolves began shifting into their lupine forms, clothes tearing and falling away as they prepared to defend their territory. But these were not ordinary rogues. Lydia realized as she watched them tear through the outer edges of the crowd with ruthless efficiency. They moved like a coordinated pack, working together with deadly precision to create maximum havoc and confusion. The largest of the attacking wolves, a massive black beast with silver markings around his eyes, bounded up onto the platform with supernatural grace and snapped the rope around Lydia's neck with one powerful bite. She collapsed to her knees, gasping and clawing at her throat, as precious air flooded back into her lungs. But the wolf was already shifting back into human form, revealing a man unlike any she had ever seen. He was tall and powerfully built, with midnight black hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. Scars crisscrossed his chest and arms, telling stories of battles fought and survived. And when he looked down at her, his gaze held an intensity that made her heart skip beats, for reasons that had nothing to do with her near-death experience. Without speaking, he scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all and leaped from the platform, landing in a crouch that absorbed the impact effortlessly. "Hold tight." He growled against her ear, his voice rough with barely contained power as chaos swirled around them. The Silver Moon Pack was fighting desperately against the rogues, but it was clear that they had been caught completely off guard and were struggling to organize an effective defense. Marcus was shouting orders while simultaneously trying to shift into his wolf form, his face contorted with rage and humiliation at having his execution interrupted. The stranger carrying Lydia moved through the battle like smoke, avoiding the worst of the fighting while his pack brothers provided cover and distraction. She could feel the muscles in his arms and chest flexing as he ran, could smell his scent of pine and leather and something darker, more dangerous, that made her wolf stir with interest despite everything that had just happened. They reached the edge of the forest in moments, where more wolves waited in both human and lupine form, their eyes glowing with predatory satisfaction at the successful raid. "Kale," one of them called out, a red-haired woman with intricate tattoos covering her arms and shoulders. "We need to move before they regroup and come after us. Marcus won't let this insult stand, and he has allies in 3 neighboring packs who will help him track us down." The man holding Lydia Kale, apparently nodded curtly and shifted his grip so that he could look down into her face. "Can you run?" he asked, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with her recent brush with death. "I think so." She managed to whisper, though her legs felt like water and her throat burned from the rope's embrace. "Why did you save me?" "You don't even know who I am." Something flickered across his features, too quick for her to interpret, before his expression returned to its previous mask of controlled intensity. "I know exactly who you are, Lydia Blackthorne," he said, and the way he spoke her name sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "And I know what you're worth to the right people." Before she could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, he was setting her on her feet and gesturing for his pack to begin moving deeper into the forest. Her legs held, though barely, and she found herself surrounded by rogues who moved through the wilderness with the confidence of those who had long ago abandoned the safety and constraints of pack life. The red-haired woman fell into step beside her, offering a worn leather jacket that Lydia gratefully pulled around her shoulders. "I'm Vera," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Lydia couldn't place. "Better of this ragtag bunch of outcasts and misfits. You picked quite a dramatic way to join our little family, though I suppose you didn't have much choice in the matter." "Join your family?" Lydia stumbled over a fallen log, her bare feet already numb from the frozen ground. "I don't understand what's happening." Why would rogues risk themselves to save someone they've never met? Vera glanced ahead to where Cale was leading the group with sure, confident strides, his head turning constantly as he scanned for threats or pursuit. "That's a question you'll have to ask our Alpha," she said with a knowing smile, "though I suspect you won't like all the answers he gives you." They travelled in silence after that, moving deeper into territory that Lydia had never seen before, despite having lived her entire life in these mountains. The forest seemed different here, older somehow, with trees that grew taller and shadows that fell darker than anything she remembered from her childhood explorations. The rogues moved with practiced stealth, leaving few tracks and making even less noise as they navigated through terrain that would have challenged even experienced hunters. After what felt like hours, but was probably only one, they reached a clearing where several crude shelters had been erected using fallen logs and salvaged materials. It wasn't much to look at, but it felt safer than anywhere Lydia had been in years, hidden away from the judgment and hatred of pack society. A fire pit sat in the centre of the camp, cold ashes suggesting that they had been away for some time planning and executing her rescue. Cale finally stopped, turned to face her, his storm-grey eyes holding secrets that she couldn't begin to fathom. The other rogues dispersed to various tasks around the camp, but she could feel their attention focused on the conversation that was about to unfold. Whatever was happening here, it involved more than simple charity toward a condemned prisoner. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a log that had been arranged near the fire pit. "We need to talk, and you need to understand exactly what situation you found yourself in." Lydia sank onto the makeshift seat, pulling Vera's jacket tighter around herself, as exhaustion from the morning's trauma began to catch up with her. "I'm listening," she said, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to hear whatever revelation was coming. Kyle began pacing in front of her, his movements restless and predatory as he seemed to gather his thoughts. "The Blackthorn bloodline didn't die out 3 centuries ago like the packs want everyone to believe," he began, his voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. "Your ancestors went into hiding, scattered across the continent, breeding with humans and weaker wolves to dilute their scent and avoid detection. But the power never disappeared entirely, it just went dormant, waiting for the right combination of genetics to awaken it again. Power? Lydia's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. What kind of power? I've never been able to do anything special, never showed any abilities that other wolves don't have. His pacing stopped abruptly, and he fixed her with a stare that seemed to see straight through to her soul. That's because you've been suppressed your entire life, kept weak and docile by a pack that feared what you might become if you ever reached your full potential. The Blackthorn line doesn't just produce powerful wolves, they produce alphas, natural leaders with the ability to command loyalty from any wolf they encounter. The words hit her like physical blows, each revelation more impossible than the last. That's not possible, she protested, shaking her head vehemently. I'm nobody, nothing special. If I had that kind of power, wouldn't I have known? Wouldn't it have manifested somehow? Vera had approached during the conversation, and now crouched down beside Lydia, her expression sympathetic but serious. Alpha blood doesn't fully manifest until it's awakened by another alpha, she explained gently, usually through the bonding process, though there are other ways. Marcus and his pack knew this, which is why they were so determined to kill you before you could pose a threat to their authority. Lydia's mind reeled as she tried to process everything they were telling her. If it was true, if she really did carry some dormant power in her blood, then everything about her life had been a lie. The weakness, the submission, the constant feral of it had been artificial, imposed upon her by people who needed her to remain powerless in order to maintain their own positions. Even if that's all true, she said slowly, why should I trust either of you? For all I know, you could be lying to manipulate me for your own purposes. Maybe you just want to use whatever power I supposedly have for yourselves. Cale's expression softened slightly, the first crack in his controlled facade that she had seen since he had saved her from the noose. Because I'm not just any alpha, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I'm alpha of the rejected, leader of wolves who have been cast out or betrayed by their original packs. Every single member of my pack knows what it feels like to be condemned for something beyond their control, and we've sworn to protect others who face the same fate. He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body and catch more of his intoxicating scent. More than that, he continued, his eyes never leaving hers, I can awaken the power that's sleeping inside you. I can make you strong enough to never fear another pack's judgment, strong enough to stand as an equal rather than a victim. And what would you want in return? She asked, though part of her already suspected what the answer would be. Nothing in her life had ever come without a price, and she doubted that pattern was about to change now. His hand reached out to touch her cheek, his fingers warm against her cold skin as he traced the line of her jaw with surprising gentleness. Be my Luna, he said simply. Stand beside me as my equal and partner. Help me build something better than the corrupt pack system that tried to destroy us both. The proposition hung in the air between them like a challenge, loaded with implications that she could barely begin to understand. To accept would mean abandoning any hope of returning to the life she had known, however miserable that life had been. It would mean embracing a destiny that terrified her even as it called to something deep in her soul. something that had been sleeping for far too long. "I need time to think," she said finally, pulling back from his touch, even though every instinct screamed at her to lean into it instead. "This is all too much, too fast. A few hours ago, I was about to die, and now you're asking me to become your mate and help you lead a pack of outcasts." Cale's hand dropped back to his side, but his eyes remained fixed on her face with an intensity that made her stomach flutter with nervous energy. "Time is something we may not have much of," he warned. "Marcus won't give up easily, and once word spreads about what happened today, other packs will start taking interest in you as well. Some may want to eliminate you as a threat, while others might try to capture you to exploit your bloodline for their own purposes. Then, perhaps, you shall have left me to die, rather than complicating both our lives," she snapped, anger flaring as the full weight of her situation began to sink in. "At least then I would have had some peace, instead of becoming a target for every power-hungry alpha in the territory." The camp fell silent around them, the other rogues stopping their activities to watch the confrontation unfold. Lydia realized that she had just challenged an alpha in front of his pack, behavior that would have earned her a beating or worse in the Silver Moon pack. But, instead of anger, Cale's expression showed something that might have been approval, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "There it is," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that she didn't understand. "The fire that your old pack tried so hard to extinguish. You just challenged an alpha, and didn't even flinch when you realized what you had done. That's not the behavior of a powerless Omega, Lydia." Before she could respond, one of the rogues who had been standing guard at the edge of the camp came running toward them, his face grim with urgency. "Kaye," he called out. "We've got company coming from the south. Looks like a full hunting party, maybe 20 wolves, moving fast and following our trail." The alpha's demeanor shifted instantly from contemplative to commanding, his entire body radiating authority as he began issuing orders to his pack. "Break camp, now. Everyone takes only what they can carry and be ready to move in 5 minutes. Vera, take Lydia and 3 others north toward the old mining caves. The rest of us will lead the hunters west and try to lose them in the river valley." "No," Lydia said, standing up from the log with sudden determination. "If they're tracking me, then splitting up just puts everyone in more danger. I won't let people die because of me." Cale turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "This isn't your decision to make," he said, though his tone held more resignation than anger. "You're under my protection now, which means your safety takes priority over everything else." "And if I refuse to go?" she challenged, crossing her arms over her chest despite the cold that bit through the borrowed jacket. "Will you force me? Drag me away against my will, like some piece of property?" The two of them stared at each other for a long moment, wills clashing in a battle that neither seemed willing to concede. Around them, the other rogues continued preparing for their escape. But Lydia could sense their attention divided between their tasks and the power struggle unfolding before them. Finally, Cale's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he let out a long breath that misted in the cold air. "If you stay, you fight beside me," he said. "No hiding, no holding back, no matter how terrifying it gets. Can you handle that?" The question struck her as both challenge and invitation, a chance to prove herself worthy of the power he claimed ran through her veins. Her whole life had been spent in submission and fear, but something about this moment, this choice, felt like the first real decision she had ever been allowed to make. "I can handle it," she said, meeting his gaze steadily despite the terror that gnawed at her insides. "But I'll need a weapon, and someone will have to teach me how to use it properly in the next few minutes." Vera appeared at her side with a curved dagger in a leather sheath, its blade gleaming with recent sharpening. "It's not much," she said, "but it's better than facing them with just your claws and teeth. The trick is to go for soft spots: throat, belly, joints, where the muscles connect. Don't try to match them. For strength, use speed and surprise instead." Lydia took the weapon and tested its weight in her hand, finding it lighter than she had expected, but perfectly balanced. The handle fit her palm as if it had been made for her, and when she gave it a practice swing, the blade sang through the air with deadly precision. The sound of approaching wolves grew louder, their howls echoing through the forest as they closed in on the camp. Cale moved to stand beside her. His own weaponza pair of wicked-looking short swords gleaming in the pale afternoon light that filtered through the trees. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone, "stay close to me. My pack is strong, but Marcus has numbers on his side, and he won't hesitate to sacrifice his own wolves if it means bringing you down." The first of the Silver Moon hunters burst into the clearing with fangs bared and eyes blazing with bloodlust, followed immediately by a dozen more, in various stages of shifting between human and wolf form. Marcus himself appeared at the rear of the group, his silver hair wild and his face contorted with rage as he spotted Lydia standing free among the rogues. "Kill them all!" he roared, his voice echoing with alpha command that should have sent every wolf in the clearing to their knees in submission. But the rogues had long ago learned to resist such manipulation, and Lydia found that the compulsion washed over her like water, leaving her standing tall and defiant. The battle erupted with savage intensity as wolves collided in a tangle of claws and fangs and desperate fury. Lydia found herself moving without conscious thought, her body responding to instincts she had never known she possessed, as she ducked under a charging hunter and opened his throat with her borrowed blade. Blood sprayed across her face and clothes, hot and metallic and shockingly real. Cale fought beside her like a force of nature unleashed, his swords weaving patterns of death through the attacking pack with fluid grace. She watched him tear through 3 opponents in as many seconds, his movements economical and brutally efficient as he protected her flanks while dealing with his own enemies. But the Silver Moon pack kept coming. Wave after wave of hunters throwing themselves at the smaller group of rogues with the desperation of those who knew their fgar. Alpha's displeasure awaited any who returned empty-handed. Lydia felt her borrowed jacket tear away as claws raked down her back, felt fire bloom along her ribs as teeth found purchase despite her attempts to dodge. "Behind you!" Vera's warning came just in time for Lydia to spin and catch an attacking wolf's throat with her dagger, but the movement left her off balance and vulnerable to the massive grey hunter that came charging from her blind side. Cale's roar of fury echoed through the clearing as he saw the danger, but he was too far away and engaged with too many opponents to reach her in time. The grey wolf's jaws opened wide as it prepared to crush her skull between its teeth, and Lydia felt time slow to a crawl as death approached for the second time that day. But instead of terror, she felt something else rising inside her chest of power, that had been sleeping for 23 years, suddenly awakening with volcanic force. Her vision shifted, colors becoming more vivid and details sharper as instincts older than civilization flooded through her consciousness. When she opened her mouth to scream, what emerged was not a human cry of fear, but the howl of an alpha asserting her dominance. The grey wolf froze mid-leap, its eyes going wide with shock and confusion as Lydia's command washed over it. Around the clearing, the battle slowed as both rogues and hunters turned to stare at the source of that impossible sound. Even Marcus stopped his advance, his face pale with disbelief as he recognized what he was hearing. Lydia felt the shift, beginning deep in her bones, a transformation that was nothing like the partial changes she had experienced before. This was complete, primal, a rebirth that reshaped her entire being as her human form gave way to something far more powerful. Her clothes shredded as muscles expanded and bones elongated. As her senses exploded into hyper-awareness of every scent and sound and movement in the clearing. When the change was complete, she stood on 4 legs that trembled with newfound strength, her coat a rich auburn marked with silver streaks that caught the light like precious metal. But it was her eyes that drew gasps of recognition from those who remembered the old stories, eyes that glowed with golden fire. The mark of true alpha blood awakened at last. The grey wolf that had been about to kill her whimpered and lowered itself to the ground in submission, its tail tucked between its legs as it acknowledged her superiority. Around the clearing, other members of the Silver Moon Pack began backing away, their aggressive postures replaced by uncertainty and fear. Marcus, however, seemed to rally from his initial shock, his own wolf beginning to emerge as he prepared to challenge her directly. "Impossible," he snarled, his voice distorting as his transformation progressed. "The Blackthorn line is dead, wiped out centuries ago by our ancestors. You're nothing but a pretender, a weak Omega trying to fake power you don't possess." Lydia padded forward on silent pause, her golden eyes fixed on the Silver Moon Alpha with predatory intensity. She could feel Kale moving to flank Marcus from the left, could sense the other rogues positioning themselves to support her, despite their obvious amazement at what they were witnessing. When Marcus completed his shift, he was impressive in his lupine form, larger than most wolves, with silver fur and ice-blue eyes that had intimidated countless opponents over the years. But as he faced Lydia across the blood-soaked clearing, something in his posture suggested that he was no longer entirely confident in his superiority. They circled each other slowly, testing for weaknesses and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The other wolves formed a rough circle around them, rogues and Silver Moon hunters alike, recognizing that this was no longer their fight, but something more fundamental, a challenge that would determine the hierarchy between 2 alphas. Marcus attacked first, his greater size and experience giving him an initial advantage as he drove Lydia backward with a series of snapping bites aimed at her throat and shoulders. But she was faster than he had expected, more agile, dancing away from his attacks while looking for openings to exploit. Her first strike came when he overextended himself, trying to pin her against a fallen log, her teeth finding the muscle just behind his front leg and tearing deep gouges that sent blood streaming down his silver coat. He yelped in pain and rage, spinning to catch her with his claws, but she was already moving. Using her smaller size to stay inside his reach, where his greater bulk worked against him. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. both wolves taking and dealing damage as they fought for dominance with savage intensity. Lydia felt her strength growing as the fight progressed, as if the violence itself was feeding the power that had awakened inside her. Her movements became more fluid, more deadly, as instincts buried in her bloodline began to surface. The end came suddenly when Marcus, frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow, made the mistake of trying to use his alpha voice to force her submission. The command rolled out with all his authority behind it, a compulsion that should have dropped any wolf to their belly in helpless obedience. Instead, Lydia met his dominance with her own, her howl rising to challenge his authority, with power that came from bloodlines far older than his pack's traditions. The two forces clashed in the air between them, invisible but tangible to every wolf present, until finally, Marcus's voice cracked and failed under the pressure of her opposition. In that moment of weakness, she struck, her jaws closing around his throat with crushing force, as she bore him to the ground beneath her weight. He struggled briefly, then went still, as he realized the futility of resistance. His ice-blue eyes meeting hers in acknowledgement of defeat. She held him there for long moments, letting every wolf in the clearing understand exactly what had transpired, before finally releasing her grip and stepping back. Marcus remained on the ground, his submission complete and undeniable, while around them his hunters began backing away with expressions of shock and confusion. Lydia shifted back to human form with fluid grace, her naked body unmarked despite the violence of the battle. Someone Vera, she thought, draped a cloak around her shoulders as she stood over the defeated Alpha, her golden eyes still glowing with residual power. "Your pack is no longer welcome in these territories," she said, her voice carrying authority that resonated in the bones of every wolf present. "Return to your lands and spread the word the Blackthorn line has returned, and we will no longer tolerate persecution of those who cannot defend themselves." Marcus climbed slowly to his feet, his human form restored but his dignity shattered beyond repair. Blood trickled from the wounds on his throat as he stared at her with a mixture of hatred and newfound respect. "This isn't over," he said, his voice hoarse from the damage she had inflicted. "Word will spread about what happened here, and there are those who will see you as a threat that needs to be eliminated. You've won this battle, but the war is just beginning." "Then let them come," Lydia replied, feeling strength and confidence flowing through her veins like liquid fire. "I'm no longer the frightened girl you tried to execute this morning. I am Alpha now, and I will protect my pack as fiercely as they have protected me." The Silver Moon hunters began withdrawing, carrying their wounded, and casting nervous glances back at the small group of rogues who had somehow managed to defeat a force twice their size. Marcus lingered for a moment longer, his eyes promising future retribution, before finally turning and disappearing into the forest with his remaining followers. As silence settled over the clearing, Lydia became aware of the other rogues staring at her, with expressions ranging from awe to uncertainty. She had just demonstrated power that none of them had expected, had proven herself capable of challenging and defeating an established Alpha in single combat. But she was still a stranger to their pack, still an unknown quantity despite her newfound abilities. Cale approached her slowly, his storm grey eyes unreadable, as he studied her transformed presence. The dynamic between them had shifted fundamentally in the space of a few minutes. The balance of power altered in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. "Well," he said finally, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, I suppose my offer to awaken your abilities was somewhat redundant. Lydia laughed, the sound carrying a note of hysteria as the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. I think we can safely say that your original plan has been completely derailed, she agreed, pulling the borrowed cloak tighter around herself as exhaustion began to replace the adrenaline that had sustained her through the battle. The question now, Vera interjected, is what we do next. Word will spread about this confrontation, and not everyone who hears it will be as easily intimidated as Marcus and his hunters. There are packs out there with resources and connections that could make our Krasin lives very difficult. Cale nodded grimly, his expression growing serious as he considered their options. We'll need to move deeper into the wilderness, find territory that's far from established packlands and difficult for hunting parties to reach. There are places in the northern mountains that might work. Caves and valleys that most wolves avoid because of the harsh conditions. Running and hiding, Lydia said, testing the words on her tongue and finding them bitter. Is that what we're reduced to? Fleeing every time someone decides we're too dangerous to be left alone? What would you suggest instead? Cale asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected what her answer would be. We're outnumbered 50-1 by the established packs, and most of them will see us as a threat to the existing order. Fighting them all would be suicide. Lydia walked to the edge of the clearing, where she could look out over the forest that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere out there were thousands of wolves living under the thumb of alphas who ruled through fear and oppression, outcasts and rogues struggling to survive without the protection of pack bonds. The old system was broken, corrupt, and it was time for something new to take its place. We build our own pack, she said, turning back to face the group of rogues who had risked everything to save her. Not just a collection of outcasts hiding in the wilderness, but a real pack with territory and purpose. We offer sanctuary to those who have been rejected by the traditional system. And we grow strong enough that the established packs have to respect us rather than hunt us. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, bold and dangerous, and possibly suicidal. Traditional pack law was clear about rogues. They were to be driven out or eliminated, not allowed to establish competing power structures. What she was proposing would be seen as open rebellion against an order that had existed for centuries. It would mean war, Vera said quietly, with every established pack in the territory. They wouldn't be able to ignore a challenge like that, no matter how much they might want to avoid the conflict. Then, we make sure we're ready for war, Lydia replied, her golden eyes blazing with determination. We train, we recruit, we prepare for the battles that are coming, whether we want them or not. But we do it on our terms, not as fugitives running from shadows. Cale studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he weighed her words against the realities of their situation. Finally, he nodded slowly, decision crystallizing in his storm-grey eyes. It's ambitious, he said, and probably impossible. But it's better than spending the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders and waiting for the next hunting party to find us. He extended his hand toward her, palm up in a gesture of partnership. If we're going to do this, we do it together. Equal partners, equal risks. Lydia looked down at his offered hand, understanding that accepting it would commit her to a path fraught with danger and uncertainty. But it would also give her the chance to build something better than the system that had condemned her to death, to create a sanctuary for others who faced the same persecution she had endured. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers and the strength that flowed between them like an electric current. "Equal partners," she agreed, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the commitment she was making. Around them, the other rogues began nodding their agreement, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to determination as they embraced the audacious plan that their new alpha had proposed. They were still outnumbered, still facing impossible odds, but for the first time in years, they had something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lydia felt a sense of purpose settling into her bones, like the warmth of a hearth fire. The girl who had faced execution that morning was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone willing to fight for what she believed in, rather than simply accept whatever fate others chose for her. The war that Marcus had promised was indeed coming, but when it arrived, they would be ready. And perhaps, if they were strong enough and clever enough and just a little bit lucky, they might even emerge victorious from the ashes of the old world to build something new and better in its place. The future stretched ahead of them like an uncharted wilderness, full of dangers and possibilities in equal measure. But for the first time in her life, Lydia felt truly free to choose her own destiny. The northern mountains proved to be even more treacherous than Cale had warned, with narrow passes that threatened to collapse under the weight of falling snow, and winds that cut through even the thickest winter coats like icy knives. They travelled for 3 days, through terrain that would have challenged experienced mountaineers, following paths that existed more in Cale's memory than in any visible trail markers. The pack moved in single file, each wolf placing their feet carefully in the tracks left by the one ahead, while scouts ranged out on either side to watch for signs of pursuit or ambush. Lydia found herself falling into the rhythm of pack life with surprising ease, her newly awakened instincts guiding her through social dynamics that had been mysterious to her just days before. She could sense the emotional currents flowing between the other wolves, could feel their uncertainty about her leadership balanced against their growing respect for her strength. The bond that connected them was still fragile, still forming, that it grew stronger with each shared hardship, and each decision made for the collective good rather than individual benefit. On the 3rd night, they reached the caves that Cale had promised, a network of interconnected caverns carved into the mountainside by centuries of geological activity. The entrance was hidden behind a curtain of ice that had formed over the mouth of the largest cave, creating a natural barrier that would discourage casual exploration while still allowing passage for those who knew what they were looking for. Inside, the caves proved to be surprisingly spacious, with chambers large enough to house their entire pack and tunnels that led deeper into the mountain's heart. Natural springs provided fresh water, and thermal vents near the back of the cave system ensured that even in the depths of winter, the temperature remained bearable for wolves accustomed to harsh conditions. "It's not exactly luxurious," Vera observed as she examined their new home by torchlight, "but it's defensible and well hidden. We could hold off a much larger force here if we had to, and there are enough escape routes to ensure we're never truly trapped." Lydia nodded, already envisioning how they could improve and expand their living space over time. The caves were rough and primitive now, but with work, they could be transformed into something approaching comfort. More importantly, they were theirs, the first territory that any of them had been able to claim without permission or tribute to some distant alpha. Over the following weeks, they settled into a routine that balanced survival needs with the longer-term goal of building something permanent. Hunting parties ventured out in the early morning hours, bringing back deer and elk that could feed the pack, while also scouting for signs of other wolves in the area. Construction crews worked to improve their living conditions, carving sleeping alcoves into the cave walls and creating storage areas for food and supplies. But it was the recruitment efforts that proved most challenging and most crucial to their ultimate success. Word had begun to spread through the underground network of rogues and outcasts about the pack that had defeated Marcus and his hunters, about the Alpha who had awakened ancient bloodlines and challenged the established order. Some came seeking sanctuary, others drawn by curiosity or the promise of revenge against packs that had wronged them. Not all who came were suitable for their purposes. Some carried too much rage, too much instability to be trusted with the kind of unity they were trying to build. Others lacked the strength or commitment necessary to survive the trials that lay ahead. Lydia found herself developing an instinct for reading potential recruits, for sensing which ones would strengthen their cause and which would become liabilities. The first major test of their growing strength came on a grey morning in early spring, when scouts reported a large party of wolves approaching from the south. Unlike the hunting parties they had evaded in previous weeks, this group moved openly, without attempting stealth or concealment, and they carried banners that identified them as representatives of multiple packs. "It's a diplomatic mission," Cale observed, as they watched the approaching delegation from a concealed observation post. "Probably sent by the Council of Alphas to negotiate some kind of settlement before things escalate into open warfare." Lydia studied the banners through a spyglass that one of their newer recruits had brought from his previous life as a merchant trader. She recognized some of the symbols: the silver moon of Marcus's pack, the red wolf of the Mountain Ridge Alliance, the crossed swords of the Warriors' Brotherhood. These were not minor territorial leaders, but representatives of the most powerful packs in the region. "What do you think they want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The established packs had been content to ignore individual rogues and small groups of outcasts, but the formation of an organized alternative to their authority could not be allowed to stand unchallenged. "Probably to offer us some kind of deal," Vera suggested from her position near the cave entrance. "Maybe a small territory in exchange for acknowledging their supremacy. Or perhaps they'll try to buy us off with hunting rights and trade privileges." Lydia shook her head, her instincts telling her that the situation was more serious than that. "They wouldn't send this many representatives for a simple negotiation. This is meant to be intimidating, a show of force designed to make us realize how outnumbered we are." As if to confirm her suspicions, the delegation stopped just outside the range of their defensive positions and began to arrange themselves in a formal formation that spoke of military precision. At their head stood a massive alpha with greying hair and scars that testified to decades of battle, experienced Commander Thane of the Warriors' Brotherhood, a legend among their kind whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was known throughout the territories. A single rider broke away from the main group and approached under a white flag, stopping just close enough to make his voice heard without coming within striking distance. "I bring greetings from the Council of Alphas," he called out, his words echoing off the mountain walls. "We wish to parley with the leaders of this rogue pack to discuss terms that might avoid unnecessary bloodshed." Lydia exchanged glances with Cale, both of them understanding that this was a crucial moment in their pack's development. How they handled this diplomatic contact would set the tone for all future interactions with the established order. "We'll meet them," she decided, ignoring the concerned murmurs from some of her packmates. "But not alone, and not without precautions. Vera, take half our fighters and position them in the high passes where they can provide cover if things go badly. Everyone else, full battle gear but weapons concealed unless I done. Give the signal." 30 minutes later, Lydia and Cale emerged from the cave entrance, accompanied by 4 of their most trusted packmates. They had chosen their clothing carefully practical gear that allowed for quick movement while still projecting an image of strength and authority. Lydia wore a dark leather jacket over fitted pants and boots, with her mother's silver pendant visible at her throat, as a reminder of the bloodline she represented. Commander Thane stepped forward as they approached, his weathered face giving away nothing of his thoughts or intentions. Up close, he was even more imposing than his reputation suggested, with the kind of presence that made other alphas step back and submit without conscious thought. "So?" he said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. "You're the one who's been causing such a stir among the packs. I have to admit, you're younger than I expected for someone who claims to carry Blackthorn blood." "I don't claim anything," Lydia replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching despite the pressure of his alpha aura. "I am what I am, regardless of what others choose to believe about my heritage." Thane's eyes glittered with what might have been amusement. "Confident. I like that in a young alpha, though confidence without wisdom tends to lead to an early grave." He gestured toward the other representatives. "The Council has sent me to discuss your future, and the future of those who follow you." "Then speak," Cale interjected, his own authority radiating outward to balance the pressure that Thane was projecting. "We're listening, though I suspect we won't like what we hear." "The situation is simple," Thane began, clasping his hands behind his back in a military posture. "Your actions have disrupted the peace that has existed between the packs for over a century. By challenging established authority and encouraging rogues to band together, you've created instability that threatens the entire regional hierarchy." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "However, the Council recognizes that you represent a legitimate grievance against certain pack practices. The treatment of wolves with questionable bloodlines has perhaps been overly harsh in some cases." Lydia felt her temper flare at his dismissive tone, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Overly harsh?" she repeated. "You mean the systematic persecution and execution of anyone whose ancestry doesn't meet arbitrary purity standards? The bloodline restrictions exist for good reasons," another voice interjected. Marcus had stepped forward from among the delegation, his throat still bearing faint scars from their previous encounter. "Our ancestors learned through bitter experience that certain genetic lines carry instabilities that can destroy entire packs from within. And yet here I stand," Lydia said softly, her golden eyes beginning to glow with inner fire. "Stronger than the alpha who tried to have me killed. Perhaps your ancestors were wrong about what constitutes a threat to pack stability." The tension in the air grew thicker as the two groups faced each other, hands drifting toward concealed weapons while alphas measured each other's strength through subtle displays of dominance. Finally, Thane raised a hand for silence. "Enough," he commanded, his voice cutting through the growing hostility like a blade. "We're not here to relitigate the past, but to determine the future. The council has authorized me to make you an offer, one that I suggest you consider very carefully. He reached into his coat and withdrew a rolled parchment sealed with wax that bore the marks of 5 different packs. You will be granted territorial rights to these mountains and the valleys beyond, roughly 50 square miles of hunting grounds that will be recognized as sovereign territory under your authority. In exchange, you will acknowledge the overall supremacy of the council and agree to certain restrictions on your recruitment and expansion activities. Lydia took the offered document, but didn't immediately break the seal, sensing that there were significant details being left unsaid. "What kind of restrictions?" she asked, though she was already beginning to suspect what the council's true intentions were. "Nothing unreasonable," Fane assured her, though his tone suggested otherwise. "You would be limited to accepting refugees from packs that explicitly release them from their bonds. No more raids on execution grounds. No more encouraging healthy pack members to abandon their rightful leaders." "And if rogues come to us, seeking sanctuary without their former pack's permission?" Cale asked, his expression growing increasingly skeptical as the true nature of the offer became clear. "They would be returned to face judgment from their original alphas," Marcus answered with poorly concealed satisfaction. "Pack law requires that internal disputes be handled internally, without outside interference." The implications of what they were suggesting hit Lydia like a physical blow. The council wasn't offering them legitimacy. They were trying to turn her pack into nothing more than a glorified prison. A place where inconvenient wolves could be dumped while still remaining under the ultimate authority of their Tard. Original leaders. "You're asking us to become complicit in the same system that tried to murder me," she said, her voice growing colder with each word. "To help you maintain control by giving dissidents the illusion of escape while ensuring they remain trapped within your power structure. We're offering you a chance to survive," Fane corrected, his own tone hardening as he realized that his diplomatic approach wasn't achieving the desired results. "The alternative is that you continue this foolish rebellion until we're forced to unite every pack in the territory against you. How long do you think you'll last against those odds?" Lydia looked around at her packmates, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. These wolves had already chosen freedom over security, had already demonstrated their willingness to fight for something better than mere survival under someone else's rules. "Long enough," she said finally, letting the sealed document fall to the ground between them. "Long enough to show others that there's an alternative to your corrupt system. Long enough to prove that strength comes from unity and purpose rather than fear and oppression." The delegates exchanged glances, and she could see disappointment mixed with resignation in their expressions. They had hoped to resolve this situation through negotiation, but it was clear that no compromise was possible between their fundamentally opposed visions of how pack society should function. "Then you've chosen war," Thane said with finality. "The council will not allow your rebellion to spread, no matter how many wolves have to die to stop it. You have 1 week to reconsider your position before we begin mobilization." "We don't need a week," Lydia replied, her alpha presence blazing outward with sufficient force to make several of the delegation members step back involuntarily. "Our answer is no. Now and forever. We will not bow to tyrants, and we will not abandon those who seek our protection." The diplomatic mission withdrew in grim silence, leaving behind only the discarded treaty and the promise of violence to come. As they disappeared down the mountain path, Lydia felt the weight of leadership settling onto her shoulders with new intensity. The choices she made in the coming days would determine not just her own fate, but the survival of everyone who had chosen to follow her. "Well," Vera observed as they watched the last of the delegation vanish into the forest, "I suppose we'd better start preparing for siege conditions. They'll be back with a lot more wolves and a lot less interest in talking." Cale moved to stand beside Lydia, his presence warm and reassuring despite the magnitude of the challenges they faced. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, his storm grey eyes searching her face for signs of doubt or fear. She considered the question seriously, weighing the comfortable cage they had been offered against the uncertain freedom they had chosen to defend. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of their pack going about their daily routines. Wolves who had found purpose and belonging after years of wandering, who had discovered that they were stronger together than they had ever been alone. "None," she said finally, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "They can send their armies and their threats, but they'll never make us go back to being victims. We're building something here that's worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary." The week that followed passed in a blur of frantic preparation as they transformed their mountain stronghold into a fortress capable of withstanding assault from multiple directions. Hidden caches of weapons and supplies were established throughout the cave system, while concealed fighting positions were carved into the cliff faces overlooking the most likely approach routes. More importantly, word had continued to spread about the confrontation with the Council's delegation, and wolves from across the territory began arriving to offer their services. Some were experienced fighters seeking a cause worthy of their skills, while others were refugees fleeing persecution who brought valuable intelligence about pack movements and military capabilities. Among the newcomers was an elderly female named Elena, whose knowledge of pack politics and ancient lore proved invaluable in planning their defensive strategy. She had been advisor to 3 different alphas over the course of her long life, before being cast out for opposing the execution of a young wolf, whose only crime had been falling in love with someone from a rival pack. "The Council's greatest weakness," she explained during one of their strategy sessions, "is that their alliance is built on mutual fear rather than genuine cooperation. Each alpha is primarily concerned with protecting his own territory and position, which means they'll be reluctant to commit their best warriors to what they see as someone else's fight." This insight led to a shift in their defensive planning, focusing on making the siege as costly and prolonged as possible, rather than trying to achieve some decisive victory. If they could inflict sufficient casualties while demonstrating that their pack couldn't be easily crushed, some of the attacking alphas might begin to question whether the campaign was worth the losses they were sustaining. The attack came at dawn on the 8th day, with hundreds of wolves emerging from the forest like a dark tide flowing upward toward their mountain sanctuary. They moved in coordinated formations that spoke of careful planning and military discipline, with different pack units assigned to specific objectives in a comprehensive assault plan. Lydia watched the approaching force from her command position, high on the cliff face, feeling a mixture of fear and exhilaration as she prepared to lead her first major battle as Alpha. Below her, she could see Cale positioning the main defensive line, while Vera coordinated the mobile strike teams that would harass the attackers' flanks. "Remember," she called out through the pack bond that connected them all, "we're not trying to win a conventional victory. We just need to make them pay such a high price that they'll think twice about future attacks." The first clash came as the assault force reached the outer defensive positions, where carefully placed obstacles and concealed fighters turned the narrow mountain paths into killing grounds. The sound of battle echoed off the cliff walls as wolves fought with desperate intensity, knowing that defeat meant not just death, but the destruction of everything they had worked to build. Lydia threw herself into the fighting with savage joy, her newly awakened power flowing through her like liquid lightning as she tore through enemy formations with devastating efficiency. Her presence on the battlefield inspired her packmates to feats of courage and strength that surprised even their enemies, turning what should have been a rout into a grinding, bloody stalemate. But the attackers kept coming, wave after wave of fresh fighters throwing themselves against her defences, while their casualties mounted. She could see that some of the enemy alphas were holding back their best troops, unwilling to commit them fully to what they still viewed as a secondary concern. The breakthrough came when one of Elena's contacts within the Mountain Ridge Alliance managed to pass intelligence about a planned flanking maneuver through the northern passes. Armed with advance warning, Lydia was able to reposition her forces to meet the threat, turning what should have been a devastating surprise attack into an ambush that cost the attackers dozens of their most experienced warriors. As the sun reached its zenith, the assault began to falter as exhaustion and heavy losses took their toll on the attacking force. Several of the smaller pack contingents had already withdrawn, their leaders deciding that the campaign was costing more than it could possibly be worth. Commander Fane, recognizing that his carefully planned operation was falling apart, made the desperate decision to lead a final push with his personal guard, an elite unit of veteran fighters who had never known defeat in open battle. If he could break through to the main cave entrance and eliminate Lydia directly, the rest of her pack might surrender rather than continue fighting without their alpha. The climactic confrontation took place on a narrow ledge overlooking the main battlefield, where Lydia found herself facing the legendary warrior in single combat while their respective forces battled around them. Thane was everything his reputation claimed: stronger, more experienced, and utterly ruthless in his determination to end what he saw as a threat to everything he had spent his life defending. But Lydia had advantages that he couldn't have anticipated. Her power was still growing, still evolving, as she learned to access abilities that had been dormant for generations. More importantly, she was fighting for something greater than duty or honor. She was fighting for the right of every wolf to choose their own destiny without fear of persecution or death. The battle raged across the mountainside as both combatants pushed themselves beyond normal limits, their supernatural strength leaving cracks in stone and gouges in the earth wherever they struck. Blood flowed from dozens of wounds on both fighters, but neither would yield. Neither would admit defeat while there was still breath in their bodies. The end came when Thane, perhaps overconfident from decades of victory, attempted to use his greater size to pin Lydia against the cliff face. She twisted away at the last second, using his momentum against him to send him stumbling toward the edge of the precipice. For a moment he teetered on the brink, his arms windmilling as he fought to regain his balance. Lydia could have let him fall, could have ended the threat he represented with a simple push that would send him tumbling hundreds of feet to his death. Instead, she reached out and grabbed his wrist, hauling him back from the edge with strength that surprised them both. "Why?" he gasped, staring at her with confusion and something that might have been respect. "You had the chance to eliminate your greatest enemy, and you chose mercy instead." "Because I'm not trying to destroy the pack system," she replied, releasing his arm and stepping back. I'm trying to prove that there's a better way, that strength doesn't have to come from fear and oppression. Killing you wouldn't change anything except making me into the same kind of tyrant that I'm fighting against." Thane studied her for a long moment, his weathered features reflecting thoughts that he didn't voice. Around them, the sounds of battle were beginning to fade as word spread that the two leaders had stopped fighting. "Your terms?" he asked finally, his soldier's pragmatism accepting the reality of his defeat. "Withdraw your forces and return to your territories," Lydia said. "Tell the council that we claim these mountains by right of conquest, and that any pack that offers sanctuary to wolves fleeing persecution will be considered our allies rather than our enemies. And in return, we won't actively recruit from stable packs or encourage rebellion where none exists naturally. But we also won't turn away those who come to us seeking freedom, regardless of what their former leaders might prefer." It wasn't a complete victory for either side, but it was a resolution that both could live with. Thane called for his forces to disengage, and over the next several hours, the various pack contingents began withdrawing down the mountain paths, carrying their wounded and leaving behind a battlefield that testified to the price of their failed assault. As evening fell over the mountains, Lydia found herself alone with Cale on the same ledge where she had faced Thane in combat. Her body ached from a dozen wounds, and exhaustion weighed on her like a physical burden, but she felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond simple survival. "So," Cale said, settling down beside her to watch the last of the enemy forces disappear into the forest below, "I suppose this makes it official. You're not just any Alpha anymore, the Alpha who stood against the council and lived to tell about it." Lydia leaned back against the stone wall behind them, feeling the warmth of his presence beside her in the growing darkness. "It doesn't feel like victory," she admitted. "Too many of our people died today, and this is just the beginning. Word will spread about what happened here, and there will be others who see us as a threat that needs to be eliminated." "Maybe," he agreed. "But there will also be those who see us as proof that change is possible, that the old ways don't have to be the only ways. Every wolf who finds sanctuary with us, every pack that decides to treat their members with dignity, instead of fear, that's victory too, even if it comes slowly." She turned to look at him, studying the strong lines of his face in the moonlight that had begun to filter through the clouds. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Saving me from execution, bringing me into your pack, starting this whole revolution?" His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with warm certainty. "Never," he said simply. "You've become everything I hoped you could be, and more than I ever dared to dream. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The bond that had been growing between them since that first day crystallized into something deeper, something that went beyond partnership or alliance into territory that neither of them had fully acknowledged before. When he leaned forward to kiss her, she met him halfway, their lips coming together with a passion that spoke of shared struggles and mutual respect as much as desire. "Together," she agreed against his mouth, tasting the promise of a future that they would build side by side. As winter gave way to spring, and spring moved toward summer, their mountain stronghold evolved from a desperate refuge into the heart of a growing movement. Wolves arrived daily, seeking sanctuary or simply curious about the pack that had defied the council and survived, and many chose to stay after experiencing the sense of purpose and belonging that pervaded their community. They established trading relationships with human settlements in the valleys below, exchanging furs and handcrafted goods for supplies that made their lives more comfortable. Some of the younger pack members began exploring romantic relationships across species lines, something that would have been absolutely forbidden in traditional pack society, but which Lydia encouraged as another step toward breaking down the barriers that divided the world into rigid categories. But perhaps the most significant development was the arrival of a delegation from the Northern Territories, a region that had remained largely independent of the Council's authority due to its geographic isolation and harsh climate. Their representative was a striking woman named Astrid, whose silver hair and pale blue eyes marked her as a descendant of the ancient ice wolves that had once ruled the Arctic regions. "We've heard stories about what you've accomplished here," Astrid said during their first formal meeting, her breath misting in the cool mountain air. "About a pack that welcomes outcasts and challenges unjust authority. My people have been watching the situation with great interest." Lydia sensed that there was more to this visit than simple curiosity, but she waited for the other alpha to reveal her true purpose. Astrid had the kind of presence that suggested hidden depths, and her pack members carried themselves with the confident bearing of those who had never known defeat. "The Northern Territories have remained neutral in the conflicts between the Southern packs," Astrid continued. "But that neutrality comes at a cost. We're isolated, cut off from trade and cultural exchange, unable to offer aid to those who might benefit from our resources or knowledge." She paused, studying Lydia's reaction before continuing. "We're prepared to offer an alliance, a formal partnership between our territories that would provide mutual defense and shared resources. In exchange, we would ask that you consider extending your protection to other regions, helping to establish similar sanctuaries for wolves who face persecution or exile." The proposal was ambitious beyond anything Lydia had previously considered, a plan that would effectively create an alternative power structure spanning half the continent. It was also dangerous, potentially provocative enough to unite all the Southern packs against them in a war that could devastate both sides. But it was also an opportunity to accomplish something truly significant, to transform their mountain refuge from a local anomaly into the foundation of a new order that could offer hope to oppressed wolves everywhere. "I'll need to discuss this with my pack," Lydia said finally, "but I'm interested in hearing more details about what you have in mind." The negotiations that followed lasted for weeks, covering everything from territorial boundaries to military cooperation to the establishment of communication networks that could coordinate activities across vast distances. It became clear that Astrid and her people had been planning this alliance for months, waiting for the right moment and the right partners to put their vision into action. The final agreement was signed on the summer solstice, with representatives from both packs witnessing the ceremony that formally established the Northern Alliance. As Lydia pressed her seal into the warm wax beside Astrid's mark, she felt the weight of history settling around them like a mantle. They were no longer just a pack of outcasts seeking survival in the wilderness. They had become the founders of something new, something that had the potential to reshape the entire social order that governed their world. It was a responsibility that both thrilled and terrified her, but it was also the logical culmination of everything they had been building since that first desperate rescue from the execution ground. That night, as celebrations continued around the central fire pit, Lydia found herself walking through the caves that had become home to over 200 wolves from dozens of different backgrounds and origins. In the sleeping alcoves and common areas, she could see the evidence of the community they had created: mixed-blood children playing games that combined traditions from multiple cultures. Elderly wolves sharing stories with youngsters who hung on every word. Craftspeople teaching their skills to apprentices regardless of their species or pack origins. It wasn't perfect, no society ever was, but it was built on principles of acceptance and mutual respect rather than fear and hierarchy. Every wolf who lived here had chosen to be part of something larger than themselves, had committed to defending not just their own interests, but the welfare of the entire community. Kale found her standing at the entrance to the main cave, looking out over the valley where lights twinkled in human settlements that had become their trading partners and allies. The moon was full overhead, casting everything in silver light that made the familiar landscape look magical and strange. "Second thoughts?" he asked, moving to stand beside her with the easy familiarity of a partner and mate. "Just thinking about how far we've come," she replied, leaning into his warmth as the night air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers up from the valley below. "A year ago, I was a powerless Omega, waiting to die for crimes I didn't commit. Now I'm responsible for an alliance that could change the course of history." "You're not responsible for it alone," he reminded her, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Everything we've built here was created by collective effort, by wolves who believed in something better and were willing to work to make it reality." She knew he was right, but leadership still felt like a burden that she carried largely in isolation. The final decisions, the ultimate responsibility for success or failure, these things rested on her shoulders, regardless of how much support she received from others. "Do you think we can actually pull this off?" she asked, voicing the doubts that kept her awake some nights. "Can we really create an alternative to thousands of years of tradition without destroying ourselves in the process?" Kale was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," he said finally, "that we don't have a choice. The old system is breaking down whether we challenge it or not. Too many wolves are unhappy with the way things are. Too many injustices are being ignored or perpetuated by those in power." He gestured toward the valley below, where their human allies lived and worked in communities that functioned without rigid hierarchies or blood-based castes. "Look at what they've accomplished without alphas or pack bonds or any of the structures we've always believed were necessary for civilization. Maybe it's time to admit that there are other ways to organize society, other sources of strength and unity." His words resonated with thoughts that had been forming in her own mind, questions about whether the pack system itself was fundamentally flawed rather than simply corrupted by poor leadership. The bonds that connected their community were based on choice and mutual respect rather than supernatural compulsion, and they seemed to be just as effective at maintaining order and cooperation. "Whatever happens," she said, turning in his arms to face him directly, "I'm glad we're facing it together. I never thought I'd find someone who understood what it meant to be an outcast, who could accept all the broken pieces of who I am and help me build something better from them." When he kissed her this time, it was with the passion of a mate claiming his partner and the tenderness of a lover who had seen her at her weakest and strongest moments. The mark he had placed on her throat months earlier pulsed with warmth, a permanent reminder of the bond that connected them on levels that went deeper than mere attraction or convenience. "My Luna," he whispered against her lips, the title carrying weight that had nothing to do with traditional pack hierarchy and everything to do with the partnership they had forged through shared trials and triumphs. "My alpha," she replied, though they both knew that their relationship had evolved far beyond such simple labels into something unique and irreplaceable. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and scarlet, reports began reaching them about changes occurring throughout the Southern Territories. Inspired by their example, small groups of wolves were beginning to band together in defiance of pack authorities, creating networks of support and resistance that operated outside the established power structures. Some of these efforts were successful, establishing small communities similar to their own mountain stronghold. Others were crushed by pack forces before they could gain significant momentum, their leaders executed as examples to discourage further rebellion. But the movement continued to grow despite the setbacks and repression, fed by the fundamental truth that Lydia had discovered in her own journey from condemned prisoner to revolutionary leader. Too many wolves had been damaged by a system that valued purity and conformity over individual worth, and no amount of force could completely suppress their desire for something better. The council's response was predictable: increased patrols, harsher punishments for dissent, and renewed pressure on neutral packs to choose sides in what was increasingly being recognized as a fundamental conflict over the future of wolf society. But their heavy-handed tactics only served to drive more wolves into the growing resistance movement, creating a cycle of oppression and rebellion that neither side seemed able to break. It was during this time of growing tension that Lydia discovered she was pregnant, a development that added new dimensions to both her personal relationship with Kale and their broader political situation. The child she carried would be the first offspring of two alpha bloodlines born outside the traditional pack system, a symbol of everything they were fighting to create. "Our pup will never know what it means to be judged by their bloodline," she said, as they discussed the implications of this unexpected development. "They'll grow up in a world where worth is determined by character and actions, rather than genetic inheritance." Kale's hand rested on her still flat stomach, his expression mixing joy with protective concern. "They'll also grow up as a target for those who see our family as a threat to their power," he pointed out. "We'll need to be even more careful about security, more selective about who we trust with sensitive information." The pregnancy progressed without complications through the winter months, even as their intelligence network brought increasingly disturbing reports about the council's activities. Several neutral packs had been pressured into joining anti-resistance coalitions, while others had been infiltrated by agents whose mission was to identify and eliminate potential dissidents. More troubling were the rumors about a new weapon being developed specifically to counter wolves with blackthorn bloodlines, some kind of substance that could suppress their abilities and leave them vulnerable to conventional attacks. The reports were vague and contradictory, but consistent enough to suggest that the council was taking their threat more seriously than ever before. Spring arrived with both celebration and crisis, as Lydia gave birth to twin daughters whose golden eyes and distinctive scent patterns marked them as carriers of the awakened blackthorn heritage. But their joy at becoming parents was tempered by intelligence that a massive force was being assembled for what the council was calling the final solution, an overwhelming assault designed to eliminate the Northern Alliance once Kree. And, for all, "They're mobilizing everything," Eleanor reported during an emergency council meeting, her aged features grim with the weight of the information she carried. 15 packs, over 3,000 warriors, plus human mercenaries equipped with weapons designed specifically for killing supernatural targets. The numbers were staggering, representing the largest military force assembled in the region for over a century. Even with their alliance partners and the defensive advantages of their mountain terrain, they would be outnumbered by margins that made victory seem impossible. "We could evacuate," Vera suggested, though her tone made it clear she didn't consider this a viable option. "Scatter to the winds. Try to rebuild somewhere else where they couldn't find us as easily. And abandon everyone who can't travel fast or far?" Lydia shook her head, her arms tightening around the infants who slept peacefully despite the crisis being discussed around them. "What about our human allies, the smaller resistance cells that depend on our support? We leave, and the Council will slaughter them all as a message to anyone else who might consider opposing their authority." Astrid leaned forward from her position at the council table, her ice-blue eyes reflecting the strategic mind that had kept the Northern Territories independent for decades. "There might be another option," she said slowly, "though it would require us to take risks that could backfire catastrophically." All eyes turned to the Northern Alpha as she outlined a plan that was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its potential consequences. Rather than waiting for the Council's assault, they would strike first not at the military forces being assembled against them, but at the political structure that held the enemy alliance together. "The Council's greatest strength is also their greatest weakness," Astrid explained, her voice taking on the cadence of a teacher addressing eager students. "They rule through fear and intimidation, which means their authority depends entirely on the perception that they're invincible. If we can shatter that perception publicly, dramatically, some of their allies might decide that supporting us is safer than opposing us." The plan she proposed involved coordinated strikes against Council strongholds throughout the territory, timed to coincide with a massive gathering that was being organized to celebrate the upcoming victory over the Northern Alliance. Instead of hiding in their mountain fortress waiting for siege, they would carry the fight directly to their enemy's heartland. "It's suicide," one of the pack elders protested. "We'd be abandoning our defensive advantages to attack them where they're strongest, with forces we can't match in open combat." "Maybe," Cale acknowledged, "but if we succeed, we could end this war before it really begins. And if we fail, He shrugged, his expression grim but determined. "At least we'll have died fighting for something we believe in, rather than cowering in caves waiting for the inevitable." The debate that followed lasted hours, with valid arguments presented on all sides. Some advocated for conventional defensive strategies, others for negotiated settlement, still others for the kind of asymmetric warfare that had proven effective in their previous encounters. But gradually, consensus began building around Astrid's proposal, driven by the recognition that passive strategies would only delay their destruction rather than preventing it. The decision was made by vote, as had become their custom for matters affecting the entire community. When the count was finished, Lydia found herself committed to the most dangerous gamble of her life, an all-or-nothing assault on the heart of council power that would either secure their freedom permanently or result in the complete annihilation of everything they had built. Preparations began immediately, with strike teams being organized around specific objectives, while support units prepared to provide intelligence, supplies, and extraction if the mission went sideways. The twins were placed in the care of trusted pack members who would spirit them away to safety if the worst came to pass, a precaution that tore at Lydia's heart even as she recognized its necessity. "Promise me," she whispered to Elena as she kissed her daughters goodbye, That if we don't come back, you'll tell them about what we were trying to accomplish. Help them understand that we didn't abandon them, but chose to fight for a world where they could grow up free. The elderly wolf's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she gathered the infants into her arms. "You'll come back," she said, with conviction that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere hope. "Your story isn't finished yet, and neither is theirs." The strike force that departed the mountain stronghold in the pre-dawn darkness consisted of the most experienced fighters from both Alliance territories, wolves who had proven themselves in countless skirmishes, battles over the previous months. They moved in small groups to avoid detection, following routes that would bring them to their various targets simultaneously, just as the Council's celebration reached its climax. Lydia's own team was assigned the most dangerous objective infiltrating the Grand Assembly, where the Council leadership would be gathered to hear reports about their military preparations. If they could reach the chamber where the 5 most powerful alphas in the region were meeting, they might be able to eliminate or capture enough of them to throw the entire enemy alliance into chaos. The journey took 3 days through terrain that grew increasingly hostile as they approached the heart of Council territory. Patrols were frequent and alert, forcing them to travel by night and hide during daylight hours in whatever shelter they could find. More than once they came close to discovery, saved only by their superior knowledge of wilderness survival and the fact that their enemies weren't expecting a direct assault on their stronghold. The Grand Assembly was being held in an ancient amphitheatre carved into a hillside overlooking the traditional meeting grounds where pack leaders had gathered for ceremonies and negotiations for over 1,000 years. Security was formidable, with guards posted at every entrance and roving patrols that made approach by conventional means virtually impossible. But Astrid's intelligence network had provided them with detailed plans of the underground chambers that connected the amphitheatre to storage areas and maintenance tunnels. If they could reach these passages undetected, they might be able to emerge directly beneath the speaking platform where the council members would be addressing their assembled followers. The infiltration began at midnight, with Lydia's team slipping through a drainage culvert that fed into the tunnel system. The passages were narrow and partially flooded, forcing them to crawl through freezing water while trying to remain silent enough to avoid alerting the guards above. Progress was agonizingly slow as they navigated by touch and memory through a maze of corridors that hadn't been maintained in decades. Several times they took wrong turns that led to dead ends or chambers filled with debris, forcing them to backtrack and try alternative routes while precious time slipped away. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only one, they reached the chamber directly beneath the main speaking platform. Through cracks in the ancient stonework, they could hear voices echoing from above as the celebration continued, could catch fragments of speeches praising the council's wisdom and strength. "Remember," Lydia whispered to her team, as they prepared for the assault that would determine their fate. "We're not here to commit murder, but to demonstrate that the Council's power isn't absolute. Capture if possible, eliminate only if necessary, and try to get out alive with evidence that we were here." The explosives they had carried in their packs were positioned carefully beneath key support points, designed to create maximum chaos and confusion rather than bring down the entire structure. When they detonated, the floor of the speaking platform would collapse, dumping the council leadership into the chamber below where Lydia's team would be waiting. The countdown seemed to stretch forever, each second feeling like an eternity, as they prepared for the moment that would either vindicate their rebellion or mark its final failure. Above them, Commander Thame's voice boomed out as he described the glorious victory that awaited their forces, unaware that his enemies were literally beneath his feet. When the explosives finally detonated, the effect was everything they had hoped for, and more. The carefully orchestrated blast brought down a section of platform large enough to dump 3 of the 5 council members into their waiting arms, while the other 2 were left stranded on an isolated section of floor with no way to reach their fallen comrades. The capture of Alpha Marcus, Commander Thane, and the leader of the Red Wolf Alliance in a single stroke sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd above. Panic spread as guards rushed toward the gap in the platform, while wolves throughout the amphitheatre began shifting into combat forms, unsure of what threat they were facing or how to respond to it. "People of the packs," Lydia called out, her voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the amphitheatre as she emerged from the tunnel entrance. "You have been told that resistance to council authority is futile, that those who oppose their rule will be crushed without mercy. But here stand 3 of your most powerful leaders, brought low by a small group of wolves who refuse to accept that might makes right." The sight of her holding a blade to Marcus's throat, while Kale and the others kept the other captured alphas under control, sent murmurs of shock and disbelief rippling through the crowd. Many of these wolves had never seen the council members appear vulnerable before, had been taught to view them as nearly godlike figures whose authority was absolute and unquestionable. "We do not seek to rule you," she continued, her golden eyes blazing with the fire of absolute conviction. "We seek only to prove that another way is possible, that wolves can live together without fear and oppression, without the artificial hierarchies that divide us into predators and prey." Commander Thane struggled against his bonds, his weathered face contorted with rage and humiliation. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled. "Kill us, and you'll only make martyrs. Release us, and we'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. Either way, your rebellion dies here." "Perhaps," Lydia acknowledged, "but the seeds we've planted will continue to grow long after we're gone. Every wolf who has seen that the council can be challenged, every pack member who learns that there are alternatives to submission there, our true victory, not whatever happens to us in the next few minutes." As if summoned by her words, reports began filtering in from the other strike teams throughout the territory. The council's regional headquarters had been infiltrated, their communication networks disrupted, their supply caches either destroyed or captured. Most importantly, several smaller packs that had been wavering in their loyalties chose this moment to declare independence from council authority. The rebellion that had begun with a single condemned prisoner was becoming a revolution that threatened to transform the entire social order. Within hours, the news would spread to every corner of the territory, inspiring some and terrifying others as the old certainties crumbled beneath the weight of change. "Your move," Lydia said to the 2 remaining council members who stood trapped on their isolated section of platform. "You can order your guards to attack, knowing that your colleagues will die in the crossfire, or you can listen to what we're offering." The negotiations that followed were tense and complicated, conducted under circumstances that neither side had anticipated. But gradually, terms began to emerge that offered a path forward for both the established packs and the growing resistance movement. The council would retain authority over their traditional territories, but they would no longer be permitted to persecute wolves based on bloodline or pack status. Sanctuary cities would be established where outcasts and dissidents could live without fear, while trade and communication would be reopened between previously isolated communities. It wasn't everything that either side wanted, but it was a foundation upon which something better could be built. More importantly, it represented recognition that the old system was no longer sustainable, that change was inevitable, whether it came through negotiation or continued warfare. The treaty signing took place 3 months later, on neutral ground that had been chosen specifically for its symbolic significance. Representatives from dozens of packs gathered to witness the formal end of hostilities and the beginning of a new era in wolf society. Lydia stood beside Cale as she pressed her seal into the warm wax, feeling the weight of history settling around them like a comfortable cloak. Their daughters, now old enough to sit up and take interest in their surroundings, watched the proceedings with bright eyes that seemed to understand more than their age should allow. "No regrets?" Cale asked quietly, echoing the question he had posed so many times during their journey from outlaws to leaders of a new order. "None," she replied, her voice carrying the confidence that came from knowing they had achieved something truly significant. "We may not have created the perfect world, but we've proven that change is possible. That's enough for now." As the ceremony concluded and the various delegations began departing for their home territories, Lydia found herself looking forward to a future filled with possibilities that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Their children would grow up in a world where worth was measured by character rather than bloodline, where outcasts could find sanctuary and misfits could discover their true potential. The revolution that had begun with her rescue from a hangman's noose had become something larger than anyone could have imagined. Not just a change in leadership, but a fundamental transformation in how their society functioned. And though challenges would certainly arise in the years ahead, she faced them with the confidence of someone who had already proven that even the most entrenched systems could be changed by those with sufficient courage. Determination. Standing there in the afternoon sunlight with her mate beside her and her daughters in her arms, Lydia Blackthorne, former condemned prisoner, current alpha, eternal revolutionary, smiled as she contemplated the bright future they had fought so hard to secure. The world was far from perfect, but it was better than it had been, and that made every sacrifice worthwhile. The story that had begun with an execution order and a desperate rescue had become the foundation legend of a new age, proof that sometimes the greatest changes begin with the smallest acts of defiance. And though her own battles were largely finished, she knew that others would continue the work they had started, building upon the foundation they had laid to create something even better for the generations yet to come. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all, not just surviving their enemies or achieving their immediate goals, but inspiring others to dream of possibilities beyond what had previously seemed achievable. The revolution would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by wolves who understood that freedom was not something to be granted by authorities, but something to be claimed by those brave enough to fight for it. As the sun set behind the mountains, and the last of the delegations disappeared into the gathering dusk, Lydia felt a deep sense of satisfaction settling into her bones. She had been saved from death by an unlikely alpha, had become his Luna through choice rather than force, and together they had changed the world in ways that would echo through history for generations to come. It was, she reflected, a much better ending than the one that had been planned for her on that cold execution ground so long ago. And it was really just the beginning of the story she and Cale would write together in the years ahead, as they worked to nurture the new world they had fought so hard to create.